Live. That's what Bruce Buck says, I think, when he does the UFC. And since Sean was a UFC ring girl and Jordan was a cut man, it works out well. So we are live for another episode of Coffee, Compliance, and Chuckleheads for Compliance After Dark, the original hashtag CCC. I'm Eric Rubenstein. I'm going to be taking the lead today. We're going to be moving around a little bit, talking out a whole bunch of things. I'm here always with my comrades in arms, Jordan, Sean. We got a lot to talk to. We got a lot to talk about. We got a lot of things to discuss. There's a lot of stuff that's been out there. First, we've got the yearly report from HHS and DOJ on enforcement operations over the past 12 months, $1.9 billion in recoveries from criminal, civil, and administrative actions. There's a lot of talk about the strike force and all of the districts that are out there, the expansion of strike force, really the opioid task force, as they're calling it, from the Appalachian over to New England. That's going to be a piece that we're going to see in next year's report for sure. Ton of enforcement stuff that just came out today. There were a couple of announcements. The biggest one that came out from DOJ was 36 people were charged and indicted, $1.2 billion in fraud. And it's the usual. I mean, it's Groundhog Day when we talk about this. It really is Groundhog Day. We're talking about the usual stuff. It's DME, it's telemedicine, it's genetic testing, it's all that. We're going to talk a little bit about that. There was also a conviction in District of New Jersey, where I was, that just came through today on compounding. So the compounding is still there. Interesting. It was an FBI case, and I think we'll talk a little bit about why it was an FBI case, why OIG was not involved. I know a little bit about the backstory of that. And then there's another piece that we really want to talk about. It's something that's become a hot button topic. It's clearly a hot button topic for Jordan, and that is the influx of money that's going into what we would call the AI of healthcare. If those of you are keeping up with it, you've been seeing, at least over the past 24 hours, a company by the name of Olive, which I don't know a lot about, but Jordan does. We're going to have him talk extensively about that. Just laid off a 450 group of people that were part of their AI and technology. And I think really the bubble was starting to burst, but now the pin is in it and it's going. So we're going to want to talk a little bit, have an empirical discussion really about how all of this money goes into AI and technology. And, it really is, as I like to say sometimes with data analytics tools, sometimes it's a little bit like a Rube Goldberg, right? It's trying to build a better mousetrap. And, how many companies can really be out there with a new solution that's this, that, or the other? So, let's talk about that. And I think, let's start with that, Jordan. So tell us a little bit, I know you're very heavy. It's not just data and technology, but you keep up on all of this stuff, AI, ML, PQRST. It's all the acronyms and letters. I know enough about it to get myself in trouble. But I know you're always big into the data. You're always big into the technology piece. As a radiation oncology guy, it's all about technology, right? It's not like going to the doctor in the old days and having them kind of tap on your neck and say, oh, you've got a goiter, let's remove it. It's all about technology. So tell us a little bit about what was Olive, first of all, and then let's talk about what ultimately was it that it evolved into.
So yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it, and the reason I think a lot of people, we talked about Olive, and Olive made the news yesterday, is for the first time in years and years, Olive was what we consider a unicorn company, and what's meant by that is a company that raises an enormous amount of money, and Olive was north of $800 million in a year and a half that they raised an enormous amount of money, which is almost unheard of that they raise this level of money. So a lot of eyes were on this. This was Columbus, Ohio's unicorn company. It's important to understand the founders of Olive AI had nothing to do with healthcare. One was actually out of some military technology space, so they had nothing to do with healthcare. And this kind of started 3-4 years ago. There was a lot of companies that entered this health tech space, were able to raise a lot of money. But again, what made Olive unique was they were really the unicorn company that had, just rapid cash raise. And as part of that rapid cash raise in capital, you just hire a bunch of people. And so the goal and the premise was they're going to automate healthcare. They're going to automate through AI. They're going to automate through machine learning, which to most of us that are clinical in the hospital, we know that that's just not how it works. But it sounds good. It's pretty. They built these Starship Enterprise level offices at these hospitals that were beautiful. They had screens all over the walls, LED floors. I mean, just something you'd see out of a Starship Enterprise for people to run, and get a bunch of their data. And long story short is, as this market started to correct, and we had talked about this almost, God, as a group, we had talked about this a year ago, and there's so much money in this health tech industry right now that when this market starts to correct, these companies, they really only have three options. One is they go for another series of funding. Two, they lay people off. And then the third is they increase their rates and try to sell more, which is obviously a hard sell. When we started selling or seeing the market correction, that's what you're seeing over the past 2 weeks. And then now you're starting to see it in big numbers with these big name companies as they're performing these layoffs. So the Olive layoff yesterday was over half of the staff. Late last night, a company called Invitae, which is an oncology genomics company out of North Carolina, Mooresville, North Carolina, laid off 1,000 people. Clarify Health has now laid off people. You will see this more and more. And it's unfortunate because there's a lot of good people that get laid off. The other thing that happens in this space is it adds to what Sean was saying, is to this bloat of healthcare, meaning did it really add value? So this is why healthcare becomes so expensive, because these hospitals have spent money and their budgets and their time and their resources and their energy and their efforts into something that poof, now it possibly may go away, it may not be supported. And so that is extremely problematic. And of course, the negative fallout is oftentimes what happens in these deals is, your upper crust of people in that company become protected, shielded. They make their money, and then everybody below them are the people, that's the fallout, the people that lose their jobs. And I think that's what we saw yesterday. Is now obviously, with social media and how connected we are and how fast news hits the information, is people see things much quicker. It
Right.
was interesting to see yesterday. I will tell you, there were several groups that created basically an Olive layoff Slack channel that allowed everybody that was laid off at Olive to upload their resumes, and we could all see all 450 people's resumes. So people have it was cool to see people helping other people out. But the circumstances to what we had talked about, back in the days of Holmes and Theranos, was the whole thing was avoidable. And I think that's what a lot of people have struggled with, is if we knew that writing was on the wall, why did we have to go there? So again, the next several weeks, a lot of people in the health tech space will see some of this, unfortunately. And it's hard because the technology is what's going to get us out, and the data, to your point, Eric, is what's going to get us out of all this. But it's got to be done with the right intentions and the right motives. Sean had mentioned weeks and months ago about the Haven Project with Warren Buffett and JP Morgan Chase, where they had all the money in the world, just like these companies have all the funding and money in the world, and they really have no clinical, no expert people that have actually done the work and can put it together, right? And so
Yeah.
it just fails. I don't know why so many people think healthcare is it's like the easy button. Like, this is going to be the fastest way to make money. Just jump in healthcare, throw a bunch of money at it, and boom.
Mhm.
And it's like a broken record. The same ending repeats every time, but yet
Well,
it happens.
so just a couple of things that are always amazing to me. So first, we all know that Medicare is the largest payer nationally, right? So most of the money that's going out, or a good chunk of the money that goes out, is on the government side. And a lot of these tools that are coming out are tools that Medicare can't really even use, right? So, there widely isn't pre-authorizations in the Medicare world. There's some very small, right? Ambulance, we know that. There's some in like the DME world. Ambulance is the one that started, and it was a success, right? It started off as the pilot project in a few different states, right? New Jersey, North Carolina. There are two others they're escaping: New Jersey, North Carolina, and California. But there's 3 or 4 states where
Oregon.
so there's 3 or 4 states where the sort of that pre-authorization, and what did they find? They find that pre-authorization in ambulance transports dramatically dropped in the cost. There's a study that OE and I did. It dramatically dropped because they found that most of these people that were getting twice or three times a week dialysis, non-emergency routine transports. And so pre-authorizations, have some role. I think there's a role. I think people will debate and argue pre-authorizations in a couple of areas. One for sure is going to be in the pharmaceutical world, right? Whether you're denying a prescription or not. And I want to debate it, but I think that there's an area for it. But what I'm amazed at is that there's this technology that's brewing to create a pre-authorization from an AI perspective when you're only hitting a certain segment of the population, the payer population, to do it, right? So smaller plans, your small Medicaid plans are not going to use it. Your small Medicare Advantage plans are not going to use it. Your regional commercial plans aren't going to use it because they don't have a budget, right? There's just no money. So, like, for example, in New York State, there was a regulation that says that if your plan has greater than 10,000 members, you need to have an SIU in place. Well, there's a bill pending that's going to probably go through that's changing that if your plan has greater than 1,000 members, you need to have an SIU. So there's all these plans, that very, very tiny plans with 1,000 or 1,500 people that are part of like a regional or a hospital system where they didn't have a budget. They don't have an SIU. So they're not going to be interested in an AI tool for pre-authorization. So, Jordan, and pre-authorizations I know are huge in the radiation oncology space, right? That's a huge piece because it even starts with an MRI or a CT. And I think the thing that people always fail to understand is that a pre-authorization is not a guarantee of payment. And you've got this situation where people believe that it is, and it's not. The pre-authorization just means we've got this process in place. So, Jordan, let's talk a little bit about that, about the pre-authorization process and why there's this huge focus on using AI for it, and where that disconnect lies.
So yeah, and I think this is the biggest part where I've spent enough time to really understand this. And those of us that have been in any kind of clinical setting understand this. Is there was a lot of smoke screen delivered to the industry over the past 3 years that a bunch of companies said, hey, we've automated prior authorization end to end, no problem. We've automated. It doesn't work that way. You're still, to your point, going to have checkpoints, documentation, the subject matter experts. And then what they say is, well, we have EPA, electronic prior authorization. Well, that's great, but it's scaled. Does it work? And to your point, the answer is no. And you almost have to just pause and use some logic and say, okay, would the insurance companies as a whole, collectively, is it their goal to make prior authorization easy and pain-free and obstacle-free and barrier-free? And the answer is no, which is precisely why EPA doesn't work. It's not widespread. And so to your point, the prior authorization piece, that where the biggest disconnect has been is that there's an easy button to it. Now, there is an easier button to it to understand the workflow and know what's going on, and to be able to track things and to have all the information. But to your point, there's got to be people involved. The other space that a lot of these AI companies have focused on, and these are the buzzwords, right? So EPA, AI, machine learning, all the buzzwords we've talked about, is we've revolutionized revenue cycle management. Guys, there are no less, if you Google, than 2,000 revenue cycle management companies. If 2,000 haven't figured it out, nobody has a magic button.
Yeah.
So,
So I spent I spent a lot of time thinking about this whole debacle with, and I apologize, I'm having some technical issues here. I spent a lot of time, and I wanted to be thoughtful about this discussion today. I wanted to take it, to use Eric's term, from an empirical standpoint, because it's easy to get caught up in the emotion of what's transpired. I think listening yesterday to Jordan in his free thinking post that he did, I thought you made a lot of salient points. And I think one of the big points that people need to understand is something that you said, and it stuck out to me immediately, which is, look at Elizabeth Holmes. everything that Elizabeth Holmes is now awaiting sentencing for, that she was found guilty by a jury of her peers, everything that she did is almost precisely what's transpired. And I'm not saying that any of these companies that you mentioned today are in the same spectrum as Thanos. I am not saying that in any way, shape, or form. But there's enough going on. But to be thoughtful about this, let's think about where we are as a nation right now from an economic standpoint. If you take where we are right now, okay, and we look at June of 2022, from an inflation rate, we're at 9.060%. Folks, we've achieved a new 40-year high on the cost of goods, the cost of services. Inflation is a killer. It's an economy killer. And one thing that a lot of folks aren't talking about, and I studied economics. So one of the things that people aren't really talking about in the mainstream media at this point, which is mind-boggling to me, is that when you have two fiscal quarters in a row where you have downturn, you have entered into a recession. That is economics 101. Now, I bring up the inflation marker of 9.060 for June of 2022, because if you take a look at the inflation rate in June of 2021, okay, and we were under the same administration, we were at 5.391%. Okay. So we still had a high inflation rate. If you go back and you look at the same time period in June of 2020, we were sub 1% inflation rate in June of 2020. Our actual inflation rate in June of 2020 was 0.646%. We had a booming economy. We had a lot of cash. I remember I went to the bank because in 2020, and Eric and Jordan, we may have had this conversation before. I went to my bank because I got a letter in the mail saying that we're cutting your interest rate. And I said, why are you cutting my interest rate? And the president of the bank, who's no longer the president of the bank, said to me at the time, because we're flush with cash. We don't need your money. That is the first time in my entire adult life that I've had a banker say to me, I don't need your cash. Well, now they need the cash and they're hurting because inflation has changed this world. I just booked a flight. Eric, we were talking about this, right? We were going to see if we could have our man day together in Philadelphia when I fly up there. I have a project next week. But I just booked a flight to Philadelphia. It normally costs me to book that flight in economy comfort, okay? It normally costs me about $389. I paid $920 for my round trip ticket yesterday. $920. You know, we go to the grocery store, and I know we're talking about healthcare, but this is all relevant, right? We go to the food store or grocery store, depending on where you live. I tend to make up my own terms. I call it a food store because they have food there and it's a store. You know, you go buy groceries. Okay. What used to cost me $146 is now $260. I am paying almost $1,000 per month more in getting less in the way of groceries than I was before. Now, we remain apolitical. And you know, Eric has a different political philosophy than what I have. Jordan has maybe some similarities with me, but some where we vary. But at the end of the day, we got to stop politicizing everything that goes on in this country, because as we continue to do this, and I think what's happening with Olive and with some of these other companies, yeah, they overestimated what their value was going to bring to the market space. They got these incredibly high X times revenue, right? 15 times, 16 times, 18 times, which is unsustainable. And the problem is, you're right. Some of the technology that they are trying to push forward, especially in the AI world that everybody's trying to talk about AI, healthcare is just not at the point of being ready to move in that direction. I go back to 2015 under the Obama administration, where they pushed everybody to become paperless charts. They wanted everybody on the electronic health record. In 2017, and I testified to this in the United States v. Bothra et al. Case in Detroit. I testified to the fact that in 2017, President Obama, in an interview about his successes and his failures as the president of the United States, was asked to opine on healthcare. And he said, ACA was supposed to be my greatest achievement, but ACA morphed into something more than what I think any of us believed it was going to be. But my biggest regret that I have is mandating providers to move to the electronic medical records, because it was such a slow trudge. And I did not realize. Now, folks, this is the president of the United States. I would say this whether it was a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Green Party, whatever party. This is the president of the United States, who is the CEO of our country, who is supposed to have advisors that can help them to guide our country in the right direction. Didn't understand that the healthcare industry was not ready for electronic medical records. And as a result, it forever changed the physician-patient relationship.
Go ahead, Eric. Exactly the point. That's exactly the point, Sean. That's exactly the point, was that there was this attempt. I mean, we do medical record reviews. We both, right? All of us are doing these. And, every single time I get a review back from an auditor, it's the same thing. Copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste. How many women can have swollen prostates? I mean, it's, how many Medicare aged women can have, because you see that, and that becomes part of this problem, was that there was this push to make the electronic superhighway part of the metric. And so with that, you've got all of the EMR systems and all of that stuff that's out there. And none of them really do what they're 100% supposed to do. They all have some issue with them, whatever it may be. We, at our company, we've got a bunch of SIU contracts where we do outsourced SIU. We request medical records. The preferred method of sending those medical records is electronically. Our SIU investigative team have eFax. You can email them. We have a secure file transfer. Can I tell you, on a weekly basis, our admin person is scanning in EMR records that were printed, put into envelopes, and mailed. The other day, we got a CD of medical records from an EMR system. So, you have to wonder, it's not a provider trying to mess with the SIU investigators, because there's a cost and there's a time. I mean, we had one provider who had to send in, it was 2 envelopes that were 4 inches thick of medical records. And it's like, you almost want to call up the provider and say, okay, where is the disconnect? Because, it's very clear. So, this evolution of where we're going with AI and ML, and you hear it all the time, CMS constantly, innovation, which just means a newer way of doing something that we did for 20 years that someone decided that they didn't like.
It's a new mousetrap. It's a new mousetrap. And, I see a lot of folks.
The Rube Goldberg.
I see.
There was no interoperability, right? So there was no interoperability. There was no standardization. They let it be the Wild West. And so now we're all dealt with, like Eric said. I mean, patients sending in or providers sending in information 100 different ways. There's no standardization. And it's actually made things much worse than the paper chart.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to be transparent with everybody. I want to be transparent with everybody for just a minute, because Eric and Jordan know this, because you're 2 of my closest friends. You guys went through this with me earlier this year. And I'm seeing a lot of comments. We got to change healthcare. We got to change this. We got to change that. let me just share something with you. I was asked to run for Congress this year. We kept it very quiet, right, guys? I'd never uh, uh, brought it up. I never talked about it. I was flown out to Austin, Texas, to meet with one of the largest political consulting agencies in the country, and they said, Sean, and they built this whole prospectus and they showed us websites. Sean Weiss for Congress, 3rd Congressional District of Georgia. It was just funny, right? Because who in the world would ever vote for this guy? But anyways, why I'm telling you this story is we got into a very long conversation about my philosophical beliefs, about my position, what my platform would be. And obviously, for me, my platform is healthcare. Always has been, always will be. If I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., I told him I've got to be able to advocate for providers, for health systems, as I have for 28 years. You know what they said to me? That sounds good, Sean. But here's what you got to keep in mind. There are special PACs that will be created for you. Those special PACs are created by donors. Those donors have very deep pockets. They have a lot of money, and they're going to put a lot of money into your campaign, millions of dollars. Just to give you an idea of what it was going to cost, in my district where I was going to go up against Drew Ferguson, who's an incumbent, just to be able to go through the primary, it was going to be $1 million minimum to be able to go through this. I don't have $1 million. Not that I'm willing to spend on a campaign. You know where that money's coming from? It's coming from vendors. It's coming from people who have so much to lose that they want people installed into Congress who are going to pork barrel for them, who are going to push forward legislation that's beneficial to these individuals. If you look at things like the Frank, the Dodd-Frank Act or Frank Dodd Act, whatever it is, all these different things, folks, the only way, and this is the God's honest truth, and I'll shut up after this with politics. The only way that we're ever going to fix the political system is by putting term limits on Congress. That is the only way it's going to happen. Nothing will ever change unless you put term limits in place. And unless you get people in there who are serious about advocating for the American people, for their constituents, as opposed to who's going to put the most money in their back pocket, nothing's going to change. So I go back and I say, as a final piece to what we're talking about here with Jordan, Olive wasn't the first. They're not going to be the last. It is nice to see what has happened over the last 24 hours with all of the people that are rallying for the 450 people who lost their jobs. But now we have another 1,000 people that just lost their jobs, and we're going to have even more people who are losing their jobs. So we're unfortunately in an unsustainable situation because we have increasing costs, right, because of inflation. But now we have a potential for a 4.5% cut to physician reimbursement from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services if the proposed rule becomes final this year. Beyond that, we already have sequestration that's in place that's reducing providers' reimbursement. We have the decrease to relative value units that's already taking place. So, folks, we've got to find a better, cleaner, more efficient way to be able to submit our claims cleanly, get them paid, and make sure on the back end we're hanging on to that money. So I will mute myself because I feel like, I'm so upset over everything that I've seen. And listen, nothing against the PE guys and gals that are out there. Nothing against you. But if you want to play in this market, find people who can actually advise you as to what you're looking at and what you're actually setting out on a course to do. Because continuing to screw things up does nothing but crush this industry for which you're not a part of, except for a very short period of time. And until you make your, 50 times EBITDA. And then you sell off all the pieces and you get the heck out. And then what you leave behind is complete chaos for the rest of us who have been doing this as a career to have to stand by and clean up. So I'll stop there. I'll get off my soapbox and I'll kick it back to you, Ruby.
This is important stuff, right? I mean, this is, it's not 100% within this fraud, waste, abuse, compliance space, but these things have ripple effects, right? They have ripple effects. Think about an insurance plan that was using Olive, and now Olive is in financial difficulty. And so what does that company do? And as a payer, if they've gotten into using for pre-authorizations or a large provider group to help process it, like there's a void that needs to be filled. When providers leave the market, there's a void that needs to be filled. And I think, that's always a piece of the puzzle. But so let's move on a little bit. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, right? Because this is going to happen. There's going to be more of these. We're going to have, on the Theranos, we're going to be talking about Theranos again soon because Sunny Balwani was found guilty on all counts. We haven't actually talked about that. And it is fascinating because they were charged with relatively the same things. Sunny Balwani was convicted on all counts, and Elizabeth Holmes was only convicted on some of the counts. And so that really does get into the jury nullification and all of that psychological stuff that goes on with that, because they were basically charged, with the same stuff. But let's talk about the really big thing that's gone on this week. And I think we'll segue into talking about the HHS DOJ report. But I think the thing to talk about is kind of today's announcement, which was DOJ announced that there was a national enforcement operation that occurred. 36 defendants, $1.2 billion in losses. This is in line with what we've seen stemming from Operation Brace Yourself, Operation Double Helix. So Operation Brace Yourself was the DME cases. Operation Double Helix focused on the genetic testing. And now we're seeing what's becoming the morphing of the two on these enforcement operations. This one targeted DME, genetic testing, and telemedicine, which, as we love to call it here on our podcast, the telefraud, because the legitimate telemedicine guys and gals aren't getting into this. I just recently consulted with a company that is looking to do at-home blood testing. Very prevalent at-home blood testing, cash patients only, no insurance involved, and it's for things like testosterone replacement therapy, HGH, and the like. It's a lab that's partnering up with a pharmacy to do this. Cash payments only, so there's no ECRA, there's no AKS that's involved. And the thing that we were talking about was the use of doctors for a telemedicine. And I said, well, you got to keep in mind a whole bunch of things. And somebody, a lot of people who have a degree in something then go on Google and get a PhD in that thing. And so, we're on a call with a bunch of people, and someone said, well, hold on, I was online and I read that there's a thing called the 1135 waiver that at least during this public health emergency, we can get doctors and, get providers involved. And, so, well, first, you're not dealing with any insurance, and the 1135 waiver only includes Medicare and Medicaid. But always remember that the 1135 waivers do not supersede a state's requirement to have a license or a registration in that state. So you are a doctor in New York. It doesn't mean that you can render a service and write a prescription for your snowbird patient that lives in Florida over telemedicine, because they are in Florida. You're writing a prescription for a patient in Florida. They're going to have that prescription filled in Florida on a prescription from New York. You may have a licensure issue. And so, these guys were very interested in wanting to know about the telemedicine piece. And this is really a great example of why you have to do your due diligence and you have to vet out your company that you're going to bring in. These telemedicine companies operate the full spectrum. They run the docs, they run the scripts, they run the DME supplier. And remember, if you're intent on committing fraud, the things that Eric Rubenstein, Sean Weiss, Jordan Johnson, our network, and the broader network of the fraud, waste, abuse, and compliance community say, you don't care about that because you're intent on committing fraud. But this was just another example of where a number of districts, District of New Jersey, my old home, the OIG office, my old home, were one of the prominent districts involved in these operations. The prosecutors from Strike Force were people that I interacted with, although briefly, before I retired. They are the cream of the crop. These people do not bring cases for which they do not believe that they have a reasonably high conviction rate for. And Sean, you know this from testifying. When you win, and I know you recently had an amazing victory with Ron Chapman. Those are unicorns. They are absolute unicorns. The government has a higher than 95% success rate on their convictions when defendants go to trial. So these 36 people, telemedicine, genetic testing, DME, it's all in that same vein. Now, what are the things that bring these people to the forefront? Probably a combination of things, the least of which, Jordan Johnson's world. It's data. Jordan, how is it that now we're looking at Operation Brace Yourself, Double Helix, all of the COVID frauds, upcoding? We've been talking about it last week. We talked about urgent care centers on the radar. Jordan, you run data every day, all day. It's what you speak to all of your clients about. How is it that people do not think that the data is going to come and bite them in the backside?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's the problem. And not only is it biting them in the backside, it's biting them in the backside much faster than they expected it to. I was sitting here reading this report, and Eric, you may have actually read the whole thing, but it talks about how they included charges against people who brazenly used the Medicare funds to purchase luxury items. And I'm sure it was crazy stuff. But number one, they throw themselves on the radar for that. But to the data, to your point, is I just don't understand it, because it is so easy for them to say, okay, you own the DME, you own a lab. Great. Let's look at your numbers. They seem high. Let's look at your numbers compared to the people around you. Yeah, they're really high. Let's look at it's so easy for them to do this. And so I think that's the problem. And I guess when you're dumb, you're committed to being dumb, I guess, but it's not going to get it's only going to get easier as they continue to have more and more of these cases. And to me, it's maybe the DOJ and others are hoping that these public publicity, but I'm not sure it's going to slow things down. I think people are committed to it. I'm reading again some of these things that it was talking about. And again, I'm sure you read it, but it says that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services took parallel administrative action against 52 other companies involved in similar schemes. Golly.
Right.
I just
so
think
you brought something that was pretty like the salient point is faster, right? So data 10 years ago was not in as real time or near real time as it is today. Data is fed in at speeds that I think in 5 years' time, we will look back and go, wow, I can't believe how slow it was, right? And so, you get data in large doses in near real time, and your ability to massage the data that you get once you get it is lightning fast, right? It's quick. It doesn't take that long. When you're talking about things in different sectors, that real time or near real time becomes very important, right? In the healthcare fraud world, we tend to be reactive versus proactive because we're not stopping claims at point of sale, right? Like in the pharmacy space. But, cases that took 3 and 4 or 5 years to get prosecuted, we're seeing that they're not taking that long, to get through that. When we look at time periods for people that go to trial, and we say, oh, the time period of the fraud was 2013 to 2018. And people go, well, why is it just now coming to fruition? Well, first of all, COVID slowed courts down for 2 years. So that was part of the metric, was 2 years of no courts. And then the other part of it is that there may actually have been instances where the provider or the defendant was looking to negotiate an agreement. And those negotiations, and Sean, you know this because you've sat in on them as well. Those negotiations, it's not like you sit across the table and go, okay, we're offering $1 million in 12 months. And you go, all right, I'm offering 500,000 in 10 months. You get back to me tomorrow. The machinations are back and forth. I always liken it to two guys from Brooklyn who are getting ready for a fight. Two guys in Brooklyn who want to fight. It's a 20-minute long fight, but 15 minutes of it is, do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is? Do you know who I am? Do you know who you're? So it's a lot of that back and forth kind of shenanigans, and it usually takes a long time to do it. The data is the fastest piece of the puzzle, and it really does amaze me at how the bad guys don't think that anybody is looking at their data to the extent that it is now. And I'll shut up in 1 second, but parlaying this into the HHS report, the one thing that amazed me that they didn't talk about, and I get it, it's an HHS DOJ report, but they talked a lot about it, a lot of things. But the one thing that they didn't talk about was what is known as the PRAC, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee,
Right.
which is a consortium of, I think it's 21 IGs. They have $120 million budget. They're going to be around for a while, and their job is to amalgamate data. And that's why you're seeing these prosecutions with people who committed PPP loan fraud and people who committed other kinds of frauds that are out there, because it's data, right? I mean, Jordan, you get data, and from the time you get it to the time it's ready for prime time is probably exponentially faster than it was 5 years ago, right? Or even 3 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why we don't have the near critical nature of the need for the whistleblower. Not that whistleblower cases don't happen, they're always going to happen, but the pure need for a whistleblower now, with the data as fast as it's available, oftentimes we can find it before the whistleblower has their thoughts together and can really figure it out. The data is already there.
Yeah, Sean, right? I mean, you've set in on dozens of settlements, dozens of prosecution. I mean, tons, and the amount of data that is typically brought forward that you see is, I mean, and we're working on a ton of these things now. Some of these self-disclosures, these strict liability cases. I mean, we're working on one right now. We're wrapping up soon. It's a strict liability case. It's data. The data came in. It took them a day or two to massage the data, and they come back and they say,
Yep.
you owe us this much money, and we're not negotiating with you.
Yeah. So to your point, and I agree 100%. We talk about this all the time, and I don't know how many more times we can say it, but data is king. Data drives everything in healthcare. It has for the last decade or more, and it's going to drive, healthcare all the way forward. The data that and before I get to that, strict liability cases, I think we're going to see more and more strict liability cases. Why? Because it's almost impossible to argue those. Right now, we put forward arguments, right, when there's no national coverage determination, and there's variance in the local coverage determinations, and the lawyer from OSIG that we were negotiating with. I mean, he kind of went, eh, eh.
Well, the problem with those is that, so the one case, so everybody kind of gets a flavor, the one case that Sean and I were working on, the provider, we don't know this because they don't tell us, but OIG did a study, and this provider got caught up in that study, and it's a strict liability, meaning the policy says this, you did this plus this, you're on the hook for the plus piece. And the problem is that the dollar amount wasn't large enough to invest in litigating it so much. So, when
That's right.
in the conversations I've got friends that are former OSIG lawyers, and they'll tell me off the record in conversations, they will say, this is a day's worth of work. They're coming up with $150,000 or $200,000 loss amount. They're getting an OIG, OE&I, or OAS, Office of Audit Services, or Office of Evaluation and Inspection study. And it says, we looked at providers that billed for, hangnails. I'm making this up. And we found that anybody who billed, the policy was that if you billed for more than 2 hangnails in a rolling 12-month period, the third one was going to be deemed medically unnecessary because of the policy. That's it. And then all they do is run data. And the data comes back and says, all right, we just found the 1,000 providers who billed a third hangnail in a rolling 12-month period. And then they send a letter. There's not a medical record looked at. It's not a medical necessity issue. There's almost nothing to argue. The problem is that when you want to argue that the LCD does not have the effect of law because it wasn't subject to the 60-day comment period. The problem is that the cost to do that with competent counsel in front of an ALJ to win your case is going to cost you $180,000. If you wrote your check for $150,000, you'd be $30,000 in the black. You'd be a little butthurt, but you wouldn't be fighting something, because what winds up happening is that if you choose to take this to the mat and you do get a demand letter filed by the by OSIG, a demand letter is the administrative equivalent of a civil complaint. OSIG, under the Civil Monetary Penalties Law, the CMPL, is authorized, unlike any other area, they are authorized to seek treble of the billed amount, not the paid amount. That's treble right. Of the billed amount, where nowhere else in the world can you do that.
And that's such an incredibly important point. I picked up a new case that Eric's going to be working with me on yesterday for a provider down in Texas who the government is going after them in the amount of $200 million because it's based on the billed amount. It's not based on the actual damages that the government suffered.
Now, is this a criminal
back?
Criminal or civil?
This is a criminal.
Right.
This is a criminal.
So there's an odd thing, and I actually testified in Eastern District of Kentucky about 3 years ago in the case involving Dr. Richard Paulus, which was a pretty well-known case. He was a interventional cardiologist, and I won't go into the facts, but they sought in the criminal case to charge him with treble the, or not, I'm sorry, not treble. They criminally charged him with the billed amount on the DRG, and it got very twisted because there were patients that were in the hospital that he didn't see for 29 of the 30 days they were in the hospital. And on the 30th day he sees them, he does a stent, they go home, and they're looking to hold him accountable for that. Now, granted, the issue, there's a couple of issues that stand out on these billed amounts. One, there's case law that supports it. Two, the U.S. sentencing guidelines under the fraud table allow you to go after somebody on a sentencing guidelines case on the calculation of loss. The U.S. sentencing guidelines have a application note that says that when the intended loss amount can be identified, you can hold someone accountable for the intended loss amount. And I will argue until the day that I die that is not applicable generally to healthcare, with a couple of caveats. One is in the pharmacy space, you generally bill what you get paid. And then typically in something like PIP or no fault, where you're billing out these very large numbers, you generally, the intended loss amount is a number that is made up out of the ether. And I will to my death, and I testified to this, that I think that the intended loss amount calculation is much more applicable to bank frauds and financial frauds. If I steal an ATM card and I go to the ATM and I put in Sean Weiss's stolen ATM card and I put $500 in and I only get $300, I am not intending to take $300. I'm intending to take $5. My bank has not allowed me to do that. When I submit a claim to the Medicare program on my CMS 1500 for $1,000 and the fee schedule is $200, I know that the fee schedule is $200. I am not intending to get $1,000, but I have to use a standardized fee schedule. So,
Right.
the problem is that it's a battle, because you're looking to resolve a matter in which someone is looking to get an intended loss amount that doesn't exist. And, ultimately that paid amount is a differentiator of that amount. It drives me crazy. I will tell you, when I was an agent and we had defendants that were pleading guilty on cases, we would typically allow them to plead guilty to the paid amount, not the billed amount. And even in criminal trials,
Right.
we really weren't pushing that billed amount, because particularly in a criminal trial, how do you sit across from a jury and you have the government has their expert on the stand and explaining the calculations of loss, because the government has to put someone on the stand, because no defense attorney is going to stipulate to those numbers. So you're going to get someone on the
But you know what
stand.
they do? But you know what they do it, Eric, and we saw this in the Bothra case. You know, and I can talk about this case now because it was handled in such a slick, you know, fashioned, just totally botched way. This is a case that never should have seen the inside of a courtroom. Never. And I'll tell you what, it was based on the analytical work done by Ryan Vaughn and Jordan Johnson, who were able to look at the data, get it over to Dr. Wayne Winston, get it over to myself. We went through it and we looked at it and we said, not a chance. There was no way. And it was mind-boggling to me, to your point, Eric, that the prosecutors were willing to stand at a podium across from a jury and look them in the faces and lie to them. And if it wasn't for the fact that these defendants had competent legal representation who knew the right people to call to analyze every aspect of this case, the doctor that was sitting in jail for 3.5 years would still be there, and these others would be joining them. So,
Right.
you know, look, we could talk about this forever. You know, the last thing that I think we want to talk about is the OIG DOJ fiscal year 2021, or the HHS 2021 fiscal year release. So why don't you take us through that?
Yeah. So,
Because I've been doing a breakdown on it online.
you have, right. So people that are, obviously people that are watching us are likely following us on LinkedIn also, but you've been spending a lot of time kind of giving little vignettes, about what's out there. It's 129 pages. For people like us, it's an interesting read. You got to kind of breeze through it. The takeaways for me: $1.9 billion, not a record year for healthcare recoveries, but a solid amount of money. Of that 1.9, 1.2 billion went back to the Medicare Trust Fund. The remainder went out to relators and things like that. And then you've got a chunk that went to Medicaid, which is a much smaller amount of money, and it doesn't pale in comparison. It pales in comparison to the government money. But what this report really is a good thing to. The good read of it is the good takeaway is that it's giving the public an opportunity to understand the breadth and depth of healthcare fraud and the breadth and depth of what the schemes are. Now, we were just having an internal discussion the other day about what is the estimated loss in healthcare. And, the statistics have stayed relatively the same. NHCAA, OIG, all kind of say the same thing. FBI, 3 to 10% is the estimate, the estimate of loss. So if you think about what we've recovered, last year, that 1.9 billion, is that on the 3%? Is it on the 10%? I think what we're going to see next year, as I think we're going to see a hockey stick number, and that hockey stick number is going to be the 2022 number and beyond, is going to be the result of all of the COVID work that's now out there being done. We haven't even scratched the surface on the amounts of money that HRSA is going to take back. That alone is going to be a huge amount of money.
And I agree with you. And one of the sections that I broke down the other day was on the COVID-19 pandemic related enforcement, right? And I think folks, who are listening to us on a podcast or watching us on the live stream right now need to understand is that this stuff isn't going away. It is only going to get more and more scrutinized as the investigators, as the payers become more familiar with the schemes, as more data becomes available to them. They're going to pick up on this. So real quick, I just want to lay these out here. And Jordan and Eric, I want to get your take on each of these. Okay. So examples of the potential risk and vulnerabilities that were identified by HHS. The first one is this: additional unnecessary services. So offering COVID-19 tests to Medicare beneficiaries in exchange for personal details, including Medicare information, when the services are unapproved and illegitimate. Now, they use the term fraudsters because that's what they are. They are targeting beneficiaries in a number of ways, including telehealth. Hey, our good friend telehealth rears its pretty head for evaluation and management, upcoding, or services that were never rendered. So what's happening is telemarketing calls, text messages, social media platforms, and door-to-door visits are taking place by these scammers. Folks, we've talked about the difference between telemedicine, telehealth, and telefraud. This stuff continues to go on and on and on. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, but this is the one that I find. And Eric, I know you're dealing with, and I want to be careful because I don't want to say anything out of context, but unnecessary laboratory testing. I know this is something that you've been dealing with. And
yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing issue. I mean, it's an ongoing issue. It's not so much the COVID test, but it's these, these add-on tests, or what we'll call the COVID add-on tests. COVID just created this sub economy that's lasted for a while. And you've got the HRSA program, which paid out billions of dollars in money in both testing, treatment, vaccination, but also HRSA oversaw the provider payment program, right? So you've got all of that. And so now you've got this situation where now you got to try to go after the money for places that may not exist anymore. Between these pop-up clinics that existed, between people who were going for surveillance testing, but where insurance, and forget HRSA, but the CARES Act did not require that insurers pay for tests for people that deny community exposure, asymptomatic without, community exposure, or needed surveillance testing. If you needed to get tested because of school or work or travel, or just because you wanted to get tested, Uncle Sam shouldn't have been footing the bill for that. The payers shouldn't have been footing the bill for that. And so, the thing, a lot of the urgent care centers that I'm working with are trying to fix this problem and I don't blame them. This was like rapid, ever changing. This modifier was added. That modifier was added. This code is existing. No, it's replaced by this code. Now it's replaced by that code. I know you and Terry Fletcher have been doing a ton of these podcasts and training and education, because it's really like every day you turn something on. I just found the other day the CS modifier, which was something that nobody was really using, right? The CS modifier allows you to get reimbursed at 100%, no cost share, if you can document that your service was directly related to COVID. So your E&Ms and all these other things, CS modifier. I'm talking to my urgent care centers and I go, hey, CS modifier, what's that? Hey, why are you using this modifier? Or our billing company, why are you using that modifier? Oh, our EMR system. It's anarchy. And I think the number one thing that these organizations need to do, get in front of it. Because OIG, if they come after you, or OSIG come after you, even if it's not criminal, if you do this as an overpayment, if you do it as a self-disclosure, you've got a single damages calculus, you have a 1.5 calculus. If OIG gets involved and it goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office, or if OSIG does something proactively, like we did on our strict liability, our guy's not getting 1.5. So, these are challenges that are going to be out there.
Yeah. I think, listen, over the next several days, I'm going to continue to break down the fiscal year 2021 report, and I'll continue to focus on the areas where I think there are significant risks to organizations, be it whether it's to the providers themselves, whether it's to the hospitals and or health systems, to skilled nursing facilities, to suppliers, whatever it may be. But I think the point that we're all trying to make is that, again, we've entered into a new era, to use my buddy Ruby's term. We've entered into a new era of healthcare enforcement, of data analytics, and a new era in investigations, which I believe in a lot of instances, at least everyone, folks, just to give you an idea, so far this year in 2022, I've been involved in no less than a dozen investigations by the government on physician practices, hospitals, health systems, and I am testifying in 2022 in 6 federal cases, 4 that are civil, 2 that are criminal. And I will tell you, that is just scratching the tip of what's going on in
That's not
healthcare right now.
including,
So
that's not including all
please,
the ALJ
stand,
stuff, right?
yeah,
That's not including your ALJ,
no, no, I do.
right?
Yeah, so far I've done 27 ALJ hearings this year. I typically do about 50 ALJ hearings a year, and I will tell you, folks, this stuff is rough. So look, hang in there. We would love to hear from each and every single one of you topics of interest. If you have areas where you are struggling to find answers, whether it's on enforcement activities, what is what from an OIG DOJ perspective, whether you're struggling to make heads or tails on prior authorizations, on data analytics, how to use your utilization reports and maximize the information inside your practice management systems, or you're looking for regulatory compliance guidance, please reach out to Eric, Jordan, myself, DM us. I think you will find out. And hopefully all of you that are joining us on this live stream tonight, y'all know how accessible we are via social media. Our email addresses are on our social media platforms. You can find it there. Follow us here. You could follow our podcast on Anchor, on Apple, on Spotify, on Audible, wherever it is that you find your podcasts. So with that said, Eric, why don't you sign us off, my friend?
Yeah. So again, a great hour. It really is amazing how quick the hour goes sometimes. I often say sometimes we've got 3 or 4 topics, and sometimes we don't even get through all 3 or 4 topics. Sometimes we get through none of the topics because things just kind of evolve as they are. So thanks everybody for another great episode, another great week. We look forward to coming back and getting another hour in of action. It's always robust. It's always exciting. And in the words of Sean Weiss, be good to yourself, but be good to each other.
I love
Have a
it.
good night, everyone.
Much love.
Y'all take care.